Hello and welcome to Dateline New Haven on WNHH-FM, New Haven's home for community radio. I'm Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make us tick. Well, today I'm pretty psyched. We have on air an author of a book I read recently. It's been sticking with me, and it's a novel. It's also, I'm going to argue in a way, kind of newsworthy given some technological advances in our society, but that may be way off, and our guest today is going to tell me if I'm all wet. Maggie Sue wrote Blob, a love story, which caused me to go back to look at the plot for the 1958 movie The Blob, which is pretty wild. And Maggie's book is out. It's a new book published by Harper. It's a great read. And we're going to talk today about blobs. Maggie Sue, welcome to Dateline New Haven, and thanks for making time.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
So The Blob is a story of a young Taiwanese-American woman who, at a low point in her life, discovers a blob she could develop into a human companion. What a fun idea for a book. And obviously it's about a lot more than that. Maggie, how'd you get the idea for that book, for this story?
Yeah, I mean, it started off as a short story all the way back in 2020. It was during the pandemic. Everyone was really isolated, and I was thinking a lot about how unlikely connection, especially romantic connections, seemed to me. And I thought about what might happen if you could kind of create your own perfect partner and what the problems that might ensue from that.
It's interesting you brought up the pandemic, because that was the time when our relationships became even more virtual. It was happening in society, and that jump-started it in a way that just keeps going ahead with AI. Was that in your mind at all? Were you doing online dating? Were you married? I mean, what was the deal with the author's life?
Yeah, I was having some like on and off, definitely online dating relationships. It felt so unlikely to meet someone, in public, in a place, especially when we were all isolating. And so a lot of that connection kind of moved to the online sphere. And yeah, AI was kind of in the back of my head as well. Like, are people kind of just telling you what you want to hear? Are they putting their, online dating profiles through Chat GPT? Like,
oh my God, that's the thing now. I was listening to some shows about that. That's pretty wild. I don't know if you listened to Hard Fork ever about tech, and they had this thing with Tinder where you get coaching on how to respond to, and you use an AI chatbot to help you practice responses, and they lead you into these canned, dishonest, non-genuine ways that just make you kind of maybe a little bit freaked out about the future of human interaction.
Yeah, it's scary.
So,
and so I was,
I'm sorry, go on,
thinking
Maggie.
about what it might be like to give the character exactly what they wanted. Totally.
And obviously you overlaid it with a story about being a Taiwanese American woman coming of age and having the dual influences of the different parents, correct? And who you are, right? And the book is just as much about who the author is. I mean, who the narrator is, than it is about the blob, I would argue. But I think you kind of got there in the end. So, Maggie, one thing I kept thinking about when I reading the book, is this a new story or an old story? Because what I first thought was, okay, this is so timely. Like, because, I don't know if you read the Kashmir Hill story in the New York Times about the 28-year woman had the ChatGPT boyfriend. She had a boyfriend overseas, but she was overseas. He kind of like would stop doing other things to go have quote unquote sex with this chatbot, but you had to keep paying to have more time. And it was kind of interesting because they wrote about it as though that were real. I don't know if you read Clara in the Sun in 2021, the novel about a sickly child named Josie who gets an AI companion, a solar paneled, but is a robot. And that's kind of picturing that for the future. So I was thinking, was this a book about what's going to happen with our relationships with inanimate objects that have human crafting and you sculpt them? But then I started wondering, is it more a story about an old story about Frankenstein, about the golem, about Pygmalion, even about how we deal with dogs and pets? I mean, when I ask you if it's either or, is the answer yes?
Yes.
But what was going through your mind? Like, have you been following this stuff? What did you, all those things I mentioned, the new stories, the new novels, the old classic tropes, how many of those consciously fit into your thinking on this?
Well, I was thinking a lot about, so my current partner is really into horror movies. So I think there was a sense in which I was really thinking about the other and the ways in which kind of that is represented through speculative elements. And I was really influenced by writers who were kind of crossing literary fiction with genre. So like Amy Bender, Kevin Wilson, I was lucky enough to have them blurb the book, so that was wonderful. But also kind of like Jordan Peele, Get Out, like thinking about how race and coming of age can kind of be shown through these kind of genre elements and the ways in which that kind of internal tumult can be externalized through
Mm.
kind of the speculative. So definitely was thinking about Frankenstein, thinking about the past, also thinking about my past. I think it is very much a story about Vi's character and kind of the surrealness of growing up Taiwanese American in the Midwest. And it's very specific, it's specifically like a college town. And all of these details from my life that I'd kind of stored up and said, oh, these are really weird in that they're so mundane, kind of the mundaneness of like, the only gay bar, the mundaneness of like an alleyway
That was a good
parking lot.
scene in the gay bar, I
Yeah.
thought, and had the different characters related to the situation. That was a good pivot.
Mhm.
This thing you brought up, Get Out, Maggie Sue. So in that case, the white people who are liberals who want to control black people and steal their brains to keep living longer, kind of Frankenstein experiment where they extract their brain, they trap them, and then the older people get to have the young person's brain, and then their bodies are no longer theirs. I'm wondering how that fits into this. Are we taking from the blob to enrich the life of the human, or like how does Get Out more specifically factor into what you ended up writing?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's such a perfect movie. I rewatched it recently and I just so inspired by how he's able to give us a situation, a conceit and characters and kind of like play within that world and it's very concise and tight. And I was just kind of thinking about maybe more in terms of like narrative craft than in terms of plot. But definitely like the idea of the body as being something that can be shaped and transformed and taken and like do we have agency uh,
Mm.
over our body or is our body kind of subject to these power structures that we are kind of born within.
And then you also like another parallel I would see is so Pio was telling a story about race with African Americans. You were telling a story about race with Taiwanese Americans, but he did it as you did in the context of a kind of story that isn't always related to race. Night of the Living Dead did have a racial civil rights theme below it, but in general, Jordan Peele was really true to the art of horror films. And
Mhm.
that was a horror film in the Hitchcockian sense that the scariest parts weren't the acts of violence, but the anticipation and the reveals. And he told the story about race within the context of the framework of a story that has had a history separate from race. And I think you've done the same thing with Frankenstein, Pygmalion, the Golem. You were telling a story that involved racial identity and place in society. But, and I guess that's one reason I would recommend this book. It's just a good story about what happens to the blob. Like what's going to happen.
Yeah.
She brings this blob, finds it outside a bar. This blob starts developing into a human. Vi, the main character, is trying to keep him stay at home. He's getting all these influences from watching TV, popping out arms. I love that scene. If you make a movie of this, that's gonna be really fun. And but then obviously it goes beyond her control. We're talking to Maggie Sue Blob, a love story, a HarperCollins novel that's out now, and I would highly recommend that you read it. So a couple of things that are interesting to me, themes in the book about when we tell a story like this, Maggie, is how we learn a lot about Vi, the main character, and her reactions as she's a young adult to her relationship to Bob the Blob, right? And I think a key transition is when she starts noticing other people in general because she has, for the first time, having to worry so much about this creature developing to a person in her house, right? And I was wondering if you'd like to read an excerpt about that on page 123 when she's at, I'm sorry, page, page 133 when she works at hotels. She has a crappy job at a hotel, a kind of mind-numbing job where she works with a woman who has very different values from her and how she sees other people. And if you wouldn't mind just reading the excerpt so we could hear a little bit of how you write.
Yeah, great. I have 3 hours alone at the desk, and for once I don't open up solitaire. I look around the hotel instead and study it like a stranger. I want to know how Bob might see the blue and gold patterned carpet, the spider plants in the lobby with their greedy offshoots reaching for the windows. As the sun comes up over the pool and reflects orange and red in the water, Rich is late and hasn't yet begun the draining and cleaning process. I think about the guests asleep in their beds. How little I know about their lives. The truth is, I've never even been inside of one of the hotel rooms, just glimpsed them in passing as I delivered towels or toiletries. During my first week, Rachel asked me if I ever got curious about the guests. We had just finished checking in a mother and daughter who were both openly crying, tears and snot running down their faces. Rachel offered them tissues as she listed off our business center hours. I just want to know what happened, Rachel said after they shuffled away, sniffling to the elevator. Don't you? I didn't at the time. Now I wonder.
And that's Maggie Sue reading from Blob, a love story, her new novel. What interested me about that, Maggie, is that I think part of your story also is about the alienation of labor, right? So this woman's a young woman, obviously has a lot going in her mind, interesting person, feeling a little bit lost to who she is and what's her role going to be like in the world as she matures. And she's working this really crappy job at a hotel, a service job. But she never really looked at the people until she had this blob she was taking care of. And all of a sudden, through emerging love or thinking about another person, you're able to re-engage with the... I don't know, that made me think of the movie I'm Sorry to Bother You. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah.
And that is also about alienated labor, and even has, like your novel, you know, that kind of creepy science fiction thing where the guy gives them cocaine and then they become horses and become his cat. I mean, it's a pretty wild story, but I think it's kind of a Marxist movie about the alienation of labor. And do you think that, are you saying here, or is this putting too much in your mouth, that in the context of alienated labor that prevents us from forming bonds with other people and seeing each other as human and kind of numbs our mind, that it's through relationships with someone other than ourselves that we can then see humanity in others in imperfect situations? Or is that like way over analyzing what you were trying to get at there?
I think that's brilliant. I love that. I think I was also just thinking about what it is to be in your early 20s and kind of, especially when you're dealing with anxiety or depression or any sort of mental health issue, it can be really all consuming. And so you kind of can be very inward. It can be very selfish in a certain way. And as someone who struggled with that, I feel like you can kind of get locked in your own world and kind of forget about the struggles or the issues of other people. So yeah, Bob really catalyzes for her through this job where she's able to observe, but she has found herself numb to the idea of observing, numb to anything other than what's going on in her own mind. But through Bob, she's able to kind of reopen herself to the idea of other people's lives.
And Bob is the blob who's trapped in her apartment, gradually growing appendages in a brain and forming into something. And it's a few pages later when she's when you see that Bob's emergence while she's at the hotel, she says, quote, "All I have to do is make it through the next 8 hours at my job, and then I go home to Bob, my real life." And my question is, which is real life? When you're the hotel job you're stuck at, or this imaginary creature you're creating as your almost AI friend?
That's a good question.
Okay. Well, that's the other thing I was thinking when you were answering before, the whole literary criticism debate, that people find things in your story that you might not have been consciously thinking of. And if you tell a story well enough that is true within the realm of suspended disbelief, meaning that it didn't really happen and blobs don't become people, but if you accept that, it feels that it's a true story based on the way you capture the way people react in life when you bring them home for dinner, what the family's going to react, all that kind of stuff, what a job's like. And I wonder if a rich novel is one that enables people to draw those conclusions that the author might or may not have thought of, but are legitimate to talk about. I was always a little skeptical about literary criticism because they always said it didn't matter what the author wrote. You're throwing out the story. I don't know where you stand on that. Are you a lit crit person or?
I'm probably somewhere in the middle. I do think one thing that's been kind of joyful for me is to allow it to have a life of its own, as Blob, as the Blob does, to allow the book to kind of find readers and find people who can take away different things from it. So I hesitate to, people ask, like, what's one thing you want someone to take away?
Yeah.
And I think, for me, I'm just happy that folks are responding and reading it. And I think that's enough for me. Whether there's been very divisive opinions on Vi, on the ending, on
really?
kind of
Tell me about
the
that.
ambiguity of it. Some people find it very unsettling. But I think, for me, the act of writing it, it's corny, but I called it kind of a love letter to my younger self. I think there's something in it. I think for a lot of people, the first novel feels almost like it's been living within you for a really long time.
Hmm.
And I feel like this story in particular, the Blob and all, kind of felt like something that felt like a little bit of a catharsis for me. So it's
Mm.
I have a little bit now. I'm in my 30s. I just had a kid, so I'm in a different place in my life to like look back on this book. Obviously, the main character is not me, but I think I have some distance from the messiness of the mid 20s that I'm able to enjoy people's responses, whether they be criticisms or things that they enjoyed about
So
it.
what did
So
people?
it's
And I want
been
to tell people what the ending is because I don't want to blow it. I love the ending, but what did people object to about the ending about Vi?
Well, I think, you call something a love story. There's always going to be people who have certain genre expectations from that.
Well, I just remember Gary Steingart's "Say About True Love Story," and I mean, I think yours is a lot closer to the ending than what he had. But I think there's a little bit of a wink when something is called that
Yeah.
nowadays, and that's what you expect. So, without giving away the ending, this is of course, I think a reader can predict this that the Blob is not going to turn out exactly the way Vi wants, and Vi is not going to be able to control her creation. Let's leave it open for readers about what happens when that happens. But you just raised the point about your book is a creation. Your book is to some extent your blob, right?
Mm.
And so, what happens to our creations when they leave our grasp and are shaped with others? How did you feel about that letting go of the book?
It was hard. I think something that I always thought was like, oh, I'm my own harshest critic. There's nothing anyone can say. But you put something out in the world, and of course, you're going to be emotionally invested in the responses. Um, but it kind of pushes you. You want to create something new, create something fresh. And I think it doesn't belong to me anymore. It doesn't, it's not something I can control. And I think there is something really beautiful about that. And that's my favorite works of art.
Mm-hmm.
People, I can go on Goodreads and look at my favorite book, look at, Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf and see that how many stars it has, what people are rating it.
Yeah.
And I think there's something kind of wonderful about the fact that everyone can have different reactions. And I've learned not to take things too personally and to allow it to have its own life beyond me.
And so, were you happy when people were trashing you for Vi's portrayal? That means they're reading it and caring, or did you still kind of hurt a little bit because it's your first novel and you got to get a little armor going?
I think I think there's something exciting about divisive opinions for some reason. Like I think if everyone was saying the same thing, then I was like, oh, maybe the book isn't doing what I want to. Like if everyone has the same critique, then maybe I should have made some changes. But I think when people have really wildly varying opinions, I'm just like, oh, that's really interesting as like that it says maybe more about you as a reader, whether you are sympathetic to Vi, whether you enjoy the ending. It just varies depending on I think your life experience and what you're coming to the book with and your own reading history.
Yeah, we're talking about Blob, a love story by Maggie Sue, novel out by HarperCollins. So in the end, I mean, I'm still of the argument that the book is more about Vi than it is about the Blob, and but we can all argue about that. But what about the question of the Blob? How much is this Bob the Blob? How much in different incarnations is this character going to be more of a factor in our lives moving forward? Have you thought about that? Has the book prompted any discussion about that? About with all our friends, I forget the name of the now popular, not Eugene, one of the new chat bots. Everybody's got a new one they like, and they are, Microsoft is, I mean, not Microsoft, Meta is allowing people to have romantic relationships, even kids with their chat bots. How much do you see Bob as an avatar of what's going to be increasingly a kind of relationship formed in our society, and how do you feel about that?
I mean, it's scary. It's a question that we're having. I'm working at the Writing Center at Notre Dame. It's a question we're having a lot in academia in terms of, are we allowing our students to use Chat GPT? Are we training them to use that? Is that the next step in kind of the labor industry? And more so, are we having teachers use ChatGPT? Are we just going to have robots writing the papers and then robots grading the papers? Like,
And what
how?
about love relationships? I mean, they're going to have robot relationships too.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of fear, I think, surrounding that. And I'm kind of the opinion that literature, real art, everything like that can't, um, real experience can't be kind of quantified down, but we'll see. We'll see if,
Well, are you making, or is it too much to say, a plea for human relationships? I mean, Rachel, the other woman in the story who has kind of, I would argue, a shallower view of relationships, right? Although you want to be sympathetic to a person not feel snotty, right? But you know, see the view of I by, but that she would have a connection to this blob in a way that Vi in the end doesn't. Does that say something about where you see the two paths of the kind of relationships? Or again, is that an old story? There have always been shallow relationships where you had Stepford wives, you had people who marriage was a transaction, and it wasn't really about a soulful connection, and that you always had a soulful connection that can never be robotic, or I don't know.
yeah. I think there's always been performance in relationships, whether you're performing, whether you're using AI, whether you're kind of pretending to, whether you're catfishing someone, whether you're pretending to be someone you're not, just more
Pig
generally. And
butchering
so,
is the one that really gets me. Whenever I get those kind of things that are obviously the pig butchering, you know, where they have the Asian mills where the people are at gunpoint, you know, made to try to trick people out of their life savings all day through fake characters or romantic attachment. That's scary stuff.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's the woman who like gave her life savings because she thought to Brad Pitt because she thought they were dating. I think there's just so much, I think, that interests me in this kind of longing for connection that we have and the things that we grasp onto. But I do believe that art kind of can um, only be informed by kind of the artist and the lived experience and can't be reproduced. You can try to say, write into ChatGPT, write a Hemingway story, and you'll get some, very rough facsimile that doesn't give you any of the real feelings of reading of a
Well,
Hemingway
I
short story.
totally
So
agree
I
with that
think
as a
that we're
journalist.
safe for now.
Yeah, I agree with that as a journalist, but I do feel I'm going to be fooled pretty easily one day. Like now I know that ministers here are, you know, doing ChatGPT sermons, and I looked at one. I said, well, you know, this is okay, but it didn't
Yeah.
move me. I don't know. I don't know
Yeah,
where we're going to go with that.
exactly.
You know, there's also been a real genre of Asian American literary fiction in this country in the last decade or so. I don't know how you fell into this. This is how you feel your own work falls into this, or has been inspired by you writing about dual identity, being Taiwanese and American. How much of that, if this was autobiography, so you're not Violet, you're not the main character, but a lot of your life experiences here in your debut novel definitely informed what you wrote. How, to what extent do you see the Asian American experience, the dual identity experience, as driving what you wrote, and how does it fit into that literature?
Yeah, very much. And I really appreciated what you said earlier that, race is a part of this story, but it's not necessarily kind of, I would say, a story that's about race with a capital R, that is, an identity story solely. And I think something that I'm seeing more and more is Asian American writers kind of rejecting the idea that they have to write a singular story about immigration or about kind of generational mother-daughter conflicts.
That's a biggie.
Yeah,
I've
there's,
read a lot of
and you
those.
can see, like in films everywhere, everything everywhere all at once,
Mhm.
you can see that there is still that mother-daughter kind of conflict, but they're playing with it through this really absurd lens and all these speculative elements. And I think that, Asian American literature is kind of in the play with genre. I think there's a reason that so many writers are kind of moving into the speculative, moving into horror. We had Parasite win an Oscar the other year. I think, it's been really exciting time, and I have so many amazing writer friends who are kind of bending the rules and, the rules of what publishing wants, because they want a very specific type of Asian American story that can sell. And I think that kind of there's a lot of writers out there trying to bend those rules.
What's interesting to me in your novel and some of the others in the genre is yes, we learn specifically about the experience of being Asian American, the dual identity, but it's also the broader search for self, right? Who am I? Because we all have different identities. And I guess I would argue in Blob, a love story, quote, with a wink, a love story, that the answer about finding love through another really ends up being about finding love in yourself and understanding yourself before you can, like accepting yourself, before you can then be open to other people. I don't know if that's putting words in your mouth or not, or if it's lit crit, but, and that's the part that I think that, you know, while it's so interesting to look at a novel or a movie that explores racial identity and that specific racial identity, there's also that universal thread that runs through all identity stories that makes it fun and meaningful to read or watch. So we're gonna be able to watch this? Is this gonna be a movie, a Netflix series?
There's been some discussions, which is so exciting because if you read the book, I'm such a pop culture nerd and I love film, I love TV. So yeah, I think that I have a very visual, I think, writing style. So I'm really excited to see.
I felt like I was watching a series when I read it. Yeah,
oh, cool.
I kept moving from scene to scene. It was very vivid, and you really showed the action through what showed your points through what happened. You know, one of my favorite scenes is the dinner when she brings Bob the Blob for dinner to her parents, and all the different ways the family relates to her through Bob. So you have a baby. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Is your baby a blob?
Yes, and I feel like if I were to rewrite this book now, there would be so much more about motherhood and the strangeness of kind of having this thing outside of you that you feel ownership and responsibility for, because it's been really wild to have this very innocent thing looking up at you and being their whole world. And it's a privilege, and it's also really scary. I see why there's so many horror movies about, you know, Rosemary's Baby. There's so many scary pregnancy, motherhood stories, because it's quite a trip.
I do remember, though, it's amazing when you have a baby that you can love another person that much, and that then you can't imagine you can love them more. And as they emerge as more of a person, you do fall deeper in love. It's kind of nice. So what's your next project, Maggie Sue?
Again, working on kind of a horror novel that's going to have some speculative elements and going to lean more into the genre, and is set in the Midwest, and is kind of thinking about the Asian American experience again, and more so brother-sister relationships, and kind of what to do when everyone fails you and you're kind of falling apart. So similar and different.
All right, well, I'm going to read it. Blob, a love story by Maggie Sue, published by Harper. And Maggie Sue, thank you so much for joining us in Dateline New Haven. I loved reading your book, and I really enjoyed chatting with you.
All right.
Best of luck in your next. Thanks to Harry Droz behind the controls. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience performing I Wish I Knew How It Feel to Be Free from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. This is Paul Bass inviting you to fly free with us all day, all night long at WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.